Easy. Hey everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Ali. I am from the Platypus Affiliated Society. And everyone here knows what the Platypus Affiliated Society is, but I'll just give the introduction for the sake of it. The Platypus Affiliated Society is an educational organization devoted to a historical understanding of the left and Marxism. It was established in December 2006 in Chicago and focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We run reading groups, coffee breaks, which you guys know about, runs fortnightly here, panels, which we'll hopefully have later in the year, and of course the monthly reviews over here. Feel free to take them. Per usual, during my talk, if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'll be reading off the text, so if I don't see your hand, just wave a bit more or shout my name, so I'll know that you're trying to ask a question. It'll be very short, like 30-ish minutes. It'll be a relatively short teaching. Um, so yeah, we, we can start it now. I would like to start today's teaching with a sort of a motivating puzzle or a motivating question, even. Um, I would like to pose this question to ask ourselves here at Platypus as well. What is the meaning of history for any Marxian left? Is it necessary for us to understand both precedent historical change to grasp how we can create new conditions for a better society? And perhaps most importantly, what does Marx or Engels tell us about history and capitalism that remains relevant to or has become obscured in the 21st century? To answer these questions, we can pose three potential historical distinctions or junctures that can help us with the relevancy of Marxism in more detail. The first is between ancient, pre-modern, and bourgeois modern society. The second between bourgeois society and bourgeois society in crisis, which we will term capitalism. And finally, perhaps this is less so a historical distinction, but a potential for a new history between capitalism and socialism, as a conscious task of superseding capital. Discussing these from a Marxist perspective will help us clarify the need for the left to understand history and the current conditions in ways that Marx and Engels were understanding. So, before I begin the first section, any questions on those three historical junctures? Oh, easy. Let's start the first one. Ancient versus bourgeois society. And you can see in the poster we have nice little ancient blends of history, industrial, and modern. We can ask, in the first section, we can also ask two questions here. What is bourgeois society and how is it different to ancient society? And second, why is it important to distinguish between bourgeois society and ancient society for a Marxist understanding of history? I will first answer the first question by quotes from Louis Menand. I think he was writing an introduction for a book. I forget the name of the book now, but he calls Marx and Engels as philosophers. He doesn't say philosophers; it's philosophers of the Second Enlightenment, and I'll explain what he means by the Second Enlightenment later. He states, in pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. Meaning is immanent in all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing. The idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. In modern societies, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life, since these practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo. An absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. So at first this seems vague, and even seems like Menand is lamenting modernity as this sort of absurdity about our own meaning, that we no longer know what the meaning of life is. And I guess in some sense he is right, existentialism exists. So maybe that's So he is highlighting something interesting there. But what he's also articulating is the emergence of a new substantial form of society driven by various historical progress and technical development during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that is grasping and thinking about a new form of freedom. This is also what we may characterize in Hegelian terms as becoming, where the historical task towards freedom is being taken up by society at large. Now, for those who don't know, I would guess everyone would know that Hegel is one of the greatest philosophers of the 18th century, and it comes during the era of Enlightenment, often characterized by Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, where they are theorizing and thinking about the possibility for social transformation and a scientific philosophy. When Menand states that the end of life are thought to be created or discovered, he is making this very important distinction that while in ancient society you were born into a life set out by your family, society, or the conditions you were born into, such as serfdom, slavery, or even nobility. Now, in an emerging bourgeois or modern society, again, this bourgeois and modern society is characterized as slowly emerging during the Renaissance, during the Enlightenment. People could not only articulate their own ends and means of life, but society at large is helping people develop and meet these new needs and new wants for a different life. So, what do we mean by this? What is exactly changing about the political, social, and economic roots of modern civilization, as opposed to ancient ones, that makes it possible for individuals to pursue their own ends of life? To answer this question, we can go into the roots of what we mean by bourgeois society more specifically, because so far it's very abstract when we're thinking about becoming and toward progress towards freedom. But in fact, freedom has indeed existed in ancient society. Only so it was freedom that was led by meaningful life set out by past cultures and past experiences. And even in very many examples, this freedom wasn't possible, such as slavery and serfdom as unfree labor. Bourgeois society emerging through historical progress, as well as being strengthened by the bourgeois revolutions of, for example, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, aim to abolish these forms of unfreedom and create new conditions. As written by the American Constitution, all men are born free, all men are created, born equal. I think it's equal. Yeah, there you go. So, in some sense, these bourgeois revolutions and this bourgeois society is articulating a new form of freedom and equality for mainly in emerging in Europe and America, but also spreading across the world. Now, going to the semantic, I guess bourgeois in the French origin literally means city man. And so bourgeois society emerged as this qualitative shift in social relations after feudal society. As previously said, defined by strict historical hierarchies such as serfs and nobilities, as well as the religious order. To be bourgeois is not to be a member of the bourgeoisie, but rather refers to the specific social relations based on free labor and equal exchange in these new emerging big cities. That I could go to any producer or employer and exchange my labor for wages, and to be able to use these wages to pursue whatever I want to with my life. And finally, we are seeing, as the result of these various bourgeois revolutions, new political transformations, the Commonwealth and the sovereign of the people. Democracy was in its very infancy, but it was starting to emerge, as we see in the American Revolution, as well as economic transformations such as advanced modes of production, division of labor, and international trade, as making possible becoming of freedom in society. This is precisely what Smith means when he talks about commercial society as a form of bourgeois society where we are advancing freedom. Now we can move on to the second question. Why is it important to understand bourgeois society from a Marxist viewpoint? We might be inclined to think that Marx is only concerned with capitalism, that bourgeois society poses the same problem to us as does capitalism. I will discuss the distinction between the two later, but for now I would like to invoke Marx's early life, where as a young Hegelian, his understanding of history and progress is one articulated by Hegel himself, as history being the history of freedom. He is a student of Hegel, not as like a direct student, but he understands, he has read Hegel, and he knows what Hegel is talking about in some sense. And more so, a student of the Enlightenment, which was articulating the forms and possibilities of emerging bourgeois society. Marx writes in the Grundrisse, which was kind of a previous work before the Capital, that was never published until the 20th century. What is freedom if not the absolute working out of his created by his humans, of his creative potentialities, with no presupposition other than previous historic development, which makes this totality of development, i.e., the development of all human powers as such the end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick. Yardstick is like a unit of measurement. And what he means here is that the emergence of bourgeois society is indeed this progress where we are measuring as our freedom by standards that were no longer applicable in the ancient world. We were coming up with new standards and new forms of freedom. Marx was, before a socialist or an activist, a revolutionary. Before he was a socialist, an activist, or a revolutionary, he was a student of the philosophy of the Enlightenment. He understood the stakes of society to be the full development of human freedom, which in his praise of the American and French Revolution finds within Hegel's dialectical idealism a guide, but a limited one, as I'll discuss later in the talk, towards achieving free society. As Manan himself articulates from the same page, which I quoted, Marxism gave a meaning to modernity. It said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. End quote. It is generated by not end quote. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points towards an end, which is the establishment of a classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there are many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of a meaning in which human beings might participate in history itself. Marx and Engels were the philosophers of the Second Enlightenment. Again, the term philosophers. That's the end of the first section between distinguishing ancient and bourgeois society. The next historical distinction I would like to make is between bourgeois society and capitalism. Yeah, go for it.
While we're talking about AP societies, generally the way I see it laid out is communism, slave society, feudalism, bourgeois society as a core. Is there a reason that you've chosen to sort of lump slave society and feudalism together as traditional civilization? Is that intentional?
In some sense, it is because you're right. Before bourgeois society, there has existed different forms of society. You could go from the very early agricultural life, where there was, in some sense, class distinction in those agricultural life, and then even the great Roman Empire was still part of ancient society because of the fact that within ancient society, those ends of life, as Manan says himself, were given out in the beginning. The certain forms of production and the certain forms of freedom certainly has progressed from 10,000 years ago to, let's say, 2,000 years ago. But what's very distinctive about the last 400, probably 400 years is that people are taking up this meaning of freedom and the ends of life on a much grander scale. And society is also taking it up on a grander scale. Of course, as we know, even Smith himself takes influence from the society of the Roman Empire. So within a society, within history, we can see notions of rationality and freedom. The key distinction with bourgeois society is that it's starting to go through these technological, and social developments that have never been seen before in some sense. Any more questions before the second phase? Easy. The second distinction, bourgeois society versus capitalism. This next section of the talk will get into the main points about the distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism. Clarifying this distinction will not only help us understand what has changed politically and economically to better grasp how change can occur, but also to recognize an important distinction between the first enlightenment of Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel, and what Menon means by the second enlightenment of Marx and Engels. And I'll also discuss the second enlightenment more so in the third section of capitalism as opposed to socialism. As this bourgeois society, there isn't one distinct historical event that we can say that capitalism emerges and bourgeois society disappears. Rather, unlike ancient society and bourgeois society, the distinction made in the first half or the first third, where bourgeois society is a historical leap forward, capitalism is bourgeois society in crisis. During the late 18th century, but also within the early 19th century, and specifically coming into fruition in the 1840s, the primitive accumulation of capital alongside the Industrial Revolution and heightened class divisions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and here bourgeoisie does mean the owners of capital, led not to a great didn't lead to a greater emancipation of labor and the social productive capacities of society, but to a huge crisis of bourgeois society. What do we mean by crisis? Crisis here refers to not just a sort of a hiccup in the development and the progression of bourgeois society towards freedom. It wasn't like a small shock that would go away. It would figure things out and we're going towards freedom. But there was an internal contradiction within capitalism rooted in both bourgeois ideology, the Industrial Revolution, and bourgeois political economy. This contradiction within society in industrial production is particularly centered around the acceleration of the primitive accumulation of capital. To quote Christopher Throne, capital is completely unprecedented in the history of humanity. Hence, any struggle for emancipation beyond capital is also completely unprecedented. I also have the sheets in front of you guys where you can kind of map out the distinctions between both ancient and bourgeois society, and more importantly, bourgeois society and capitalism. And so, what do we mean by capital in some sense? What does even Chris, I guess we could ask, means by capital? Here, capital is not just a sort of an economic category, but it's a social relation between individuals and the modes of production and wages, between individuals and these forces of production, and individuals between themselves and for themselves. The accumulation of capital that was rapidly underway changed the structure of urban society and social relations immensely. The basis for the free exchange of labor was now expressed as exploitation and poverty. As Marx expresses in his economic and philosophic manuscripts, where alienation represented riches and prosperity for the owning few, it meant poverty and exploitation for the many workings, as well as a high percentage of unemployment, which was very unprecedented in history and was even not thought of to be possible by bourgeois political economists, including below living standard wages, domination of private property, social antagonisms rising between workers and bosses, famine, which one example was the Irish famine, yep, and etc. All were byproducts of this new phenomena of primitively accumulating capital. This was in some sense the crisis of capital. That capitalism is really the expression of this contradiction between capital and labor. Capital would devour, dominate living labor, constantly move towards lower wages, increase working times, creating lesser jobs. And in some sense, this also represents this contradiction that during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, people were thinking about that these machinery, these new forms of production would actually be emancipatory, that I can work 3 hours a day, have enough wages to provide for my family, and do what I want. But really, this was no longer the case. This was expressing itself in a crisis. The industrial forces of production wore out stripping labor, where promises of superfluous work become great. This is what Marx means when he talks about the sorcerer in the Communist Manifesto losing control over his own powers and the conglomeration he has made. which is the same with bourgeois political economy and the forces of production growing beyond the control of society and no longer providing for the needs and the basis for prosperity and freedom. It seems we have developed technology so much that we could become freer and work less, but have become unfree at the same time. That society is more dynamic, but at the same time oppressive and static. This is also what Max Horkheimer, a thinker of the Frankfurt School in the mid-20th century, meant by the social domination of capital over all of society. Industrial society was becoming a horrid semblance of bourgeois society, rising from these inner contradictions between the industrial forces of production and bourgeois social relations. In other words, its economic and social dynamism was contradicted at the same time by static social relations of production. That is, who controls and directs the social surplus of society. Its economic dynamism, such as with new efficient machinery, division of labor, and social dynamism, even we could see with the spreading of information, news, knowledge, and technology, were counterposed by the destructive tendency to valorize labor, reduce social freedom, and maintain a social hold on the economy and society. This contradiction manifests itself distinctly as the contradiction between the two major classes within industrial society, the working class and the bourgeoisie. Why is it the working class that are the new agents of this new revolution? Is because they are the most impoverished and poor, but also the large majority of society who have the capacity to develop historical consciousness to surpass capitalism. The same way that with the bourgeois revolutions, it was the bourgeoisie and also the third estate that were developing consciousness for advancing civil society and bourgeois society. It is now the proletarialization of the working class and a large majority of the people that is the new basis for a new society. I'll get into what this new society, aka socialism, means. Now that we have outlined the distinction between bourgeois society and capitalism, like the first section, we can actually ask the question, why this distinction important for a Marxist viewpoint? The answer to this question seems more obvious, since Marx's writing very clearly outlines the crisis of capitalism and the need to go beyond it, which will be discussed in the next section. But what is perhaps not so obvious is the distinction Marx makes between capitalism and bourgeois society not as a purely moral one, where one society is morally superior to another due to the overall good it creates for the members of society. Rather than being a vicious anti-capitalist, Marx understands that the accelerated productive capacities under capitalism, the new modes of production, and even ideological changes, as he says, that all that is solid melts to the air, all that is holy is profaned, are important and even necessary steps for the next progress of freedom, being socialism. Now, this seems a bit contradictory because earlier I said that bourgeois society is a qualitative leap towards achieving freedom and a perfect civil society, as Kant puts it. But if capitalism is bourgeois society in crisis, how could it be necessary for the next stage within society? Even more so, we might ask intuitively that all the destruction that capitalism has brought distinguishes it as something that must be done away with. What's important, however, in any Marxist understanding of capitalism, perhaps, is that rather than posing it as a moral and productive, rather than posing capitalism as a moral and productive blockade to the possibility of bourgeois freedom, the prosperity of the bourgeois individual, instead Marx poses it as a need to surpass the notion of bourgeois ideology and political economy altogether. I will illustrate this by a very long quote from Marx, again from the Grundrisse. The object before us to begin with material production, and I've quoted this once in the coffee break. Individuals producing in society, hence socially determined individual production, is of course the point of departure. The individual and isolated hunter and fisherman with whom Smith and Ricardo begin, belong among the unimaginative conceits of the 18th century Robinsonites, which in no way express merely a reaction against over-sophistication and a return to a misunderstood natural life, as cultural historians imagine it, And just before I continue, Robinson Crusoe was this novel where we would imagine one individual in an island who would produce for himself. In some sense, the ideal bourgeois man, where he's fully self subsistent. As little as Rousseau's contract social, which brings naturally independent, autonomous subjects into relation and connection by contract, rests on such naturalism. This is the semblance, the merely aesthetic semblance of the Robinsonades, great and small. It is rather the anticipation of civil society. In preparation since the 16th century, and making great strides toward a maturity in the 18th, in this society of free competition, the individual appears detached from the natural bonds, etc., which in earlier historical periods make him the accessory of a definite and limited human conglomerate. Smith and Ricardo still stand with both feet on the shoulders of 18th century prophets, in whose imagination this 18th century individual, the product on one side of the dissolution of feudal forms of society, on the other hand of the new forces of production developed since the 16th century, appears as an ideal whose existence they project into the past, not as a historic result, but as history's point of departure, as the natural individual appropriate to their notion of human nature, not arising historically, but posited by nature. This illusion has been common to each new epoch of this day. Capitalism has, end quote by the way, capitalism has tore through and wrought into crisis the free bourgeois subject, which Marx is talking about, with the forms of bourgeois political economy, that of Smith and Ricardo, and ideology being no longer adequate in industrial society. And by bourgeois ideology here, we can also refer to German idealism as one form of bourgeois ideology. To go beyond these contradictions, then, is not simply a matter of removing them, like one removes bad qualities from a functioning society, or I would like to make a funny example of removing the yellow snakes from a confectionery bag. It's more about a totality of society as a whole. As Karl Korsch puts it, a Marxist, Karl Korsch being a Marxist, writing after the regression of the Russian Revolution in the 20s and the 30s, the bourgeois standpoint, that of free labor and equal exchange, has to stop in theory where it has to stop in social practice, as long as it does not want to cease being a bourgeois standpoint altogether. In other words, supersede itself. So here we can see that Korsch is also articulating the fact that this bourgeois standpoint of political economy and ideology is becoming wholly inadequate within capitalism. Rather, the economic, social, and political transformations within capitalism must be met with a new possibility and analysis of society that would surpass bourgeois political economy once and for all, in favor of what shall we discuss now, socialism and capitalism versus socialism. Any questions before the final section? Easy. In this historical juncture, or at least historical possibility, because in some sense socialism has existed but has never been fully realized internationally, or even now we can not fully say we have a functioning or a very adequate socialist state, we can ask, does a worker in the Industrial Revolution during Marx's time, or most importantly, even the working class today, have an interest in socialism? Or how does Marx understand socialism? Now, before we answer this very important question, we can kind of do a bit of a historical setup, I guess. During the 19th century, there has, of course, been other movements and theorists that were grappling with the crisis of capitalism. Utopian socialists such as Saint-Simon and Fourier, as well as small socialist movements and even the Luddite movement, which was trying to abolish machinery, all expressing concern and anger towards the Industrial Revolution. What these movements and theorists attempted to rectify, as was stated above, a removal of those bad qualities of the totality of capitalism, or a complete rejection of industrial forces of production and of machinery. What's important, and something that Marx himself outlines as a critic of socialism and communism that existed before his time, is that these are all, in some sense, symptoms of capitalism. What do we mean by symptoms here? It means some necessary discontents, feelings, or even theories that were emerging out of the exploitation, the alienation of labor, but they also provide a certain insight to a society beyond capitalism, socialism, and how this would look like. That the true abolition of capitalism would be the true realization of capital. That the abolition of class society would be the true realization of the working class as becoming fully proletarianized, and thus having the consciousness to free themselves. Now, here it seems a bit vague as well what we mean by making a similarity between abolition and realizing capital. This, in some sense, tell us that socialism is actually a necessary end or a necessary step from capitalism. Here, by necessary, I mean that capitalism itself is actually already pointing towards certain demands and certain structures of socialism in the day, such as the socialization of the forces of production, the withering away of private property, which was happening for a large majority of the population, but was being concentrated in the hands of the few, as well as the complete management of society under some form of a centralized state. It was, however, expressing these certain demands of socialism in a contradictory form. And where we would, to sort of achieve socialism, we would need some form of dialectical surpassing of these contradictions. Socialism would become the full socialization of the forces of production, freeing productive forces to distribute the social surplus and increase social surplus of society. The full withering away of private property instead of the concentration of private property within the hands of the few, and perhaps the management of society under what we may call a dictatorship of a proletariat, which would eventually fade away. All this, in some sense, is also related to the German Hegelian word Aufheben, where capitalism would be overcome through negation, surpassing, and cancellation for socialism. Socialism is the next historical step in man's history of freedom. And what makes Marx and Engels' understanding of socialism as a scientific means where political economy, philosophy, and history would be the foundation of theorizing what socialism would look like. So I return once more to the question posed at the beginning of this section. What interest does the industrial worker of the 19th century or current working class have in a Marxist understanding of history and socialism? The worker of the 19th century is interested in a Marxist clarification of history and the task of socialism as a scientific goal to overcome contradictions within capitalism, as it's, in some sense, it is the most substantive and seminal scientific and philosophical work of its time, influenced by German idealism, English political economy, and French socialism, to free the working class, to provide them with their own means of having the consciousness and ability to abolish all class relations. What the socialists and anarchists of his time provided was, in some sense, an incomplete and even undialectical theory on overcoming capitalism. Whereas Marx provides us with a historical necessity for the working class to take power and use their historical consciousness, most importantly, for socialism. What interest might the worker of the 21st century have in Marxism and the Marxist understanding of history then? Currently, we live in an era largely characterized both by a regression of Marxism and the task for socialism. But also, we have in some sense progressed in the little freedoms that capitalism has afforded to us, which is what people often cite as higher wages. With no longer an international working class movement and decreasing class consciousness and even interest in the task of socialism, we may pose the question that Theodor Adorno, also a part of the Frankfurt School, posed in the 1960s: is Marxism obsolete? Is the historical task for freedom one that we as socialists, or if we do not identify as socialists, would need to look towards Marx anymore, or would we need a new theory of social transformation? Here at Platypus, and even myself personally, find that the Marxist understanding of history, as with the influence of Enlightenment and the obstacles posed by the Frankfurt School, indicate that Marxism still remains an important figure, or Marx remains an important figure in our history and especially the history of the left. It is not as it was in the 19th century that the spectre of communism haunting Europe, but now it's the spectre of Marx that's haunting us. The successes and the failures of the left that reflect how we can learn from these work towards the socialist society. To conclude, I have attempted to summarize a lot of history in around 30, 40 minutes, um, which I didn't really spend much time on, so I hope that it didn't make it too bad. But in some sense, the secondary question, but also the subtitle of this teaching, does Marxism still matter, poses a question I myself have to think about. And what Platypus also wants to think about and potentially come towards overcoming these obstacles on the left. And in some sense, the history of that talks we've had in the coffee breaks of the SPD and the Russian Revolution, we are constantly attempting to redeem these experiences towards a Marxist understanding of history. Thank you. So yeah, now we can do a 30, 45 minutes Q&A. This is purely talking. You can talk, post questions to me, and when you have an answer yourself, you can post them.
Just tiny little historical point, but the Luddites didn't want to abolish machinery.
Yeah, not a lot of slander.
I'm sorry.
They wanted machinery that like would empower them.
Mhm.
But yeah,
Okay. Yes.
Strongly progressive.
Well, they didn't want power looms for windmill. This is
Mhm.
the power looms were replacing their labor,
Mhm.
and that's what they hated. It wasn't the machinery per se, as Bill Francis.
Mhm. Yep. Thanks for that historical clarification. Any other questions or points of issue, perhaps, regarding the talk, or any vagueness you still want me to clarify, even?
I think it was really good.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Just the platypus.
Okay.
Casual distinctions.
Uh-huh.
Get it? No, it's pretty agreeable.
Right. Well, in some sense, it's a distinction that's not really a platypus distinction, but Marx himself is making this distinction. As even in the Communist Manifesto, he's not really using the word capitalism. It's kind of a weird way to kind of how can we really distinguish between capitalism and bourgeois society, which is I think Marx is making this distinction importantly because it helps him understand what capitalism is actually specifically as opposed to what bourgeois society means. And when he uses terms such as bourgeois ideology and bourgeois political economy, he's really trying to surpass these things that are becoming contradictory in capitalism.
I guess the question I'd have would be, how to phrase it. Do you think that, um, because we talk a lot about how capitalism has become historically regressive and it's something that needs to be surpassed, but we've also been saying that for like 100 years.
Yeah.
So do you think that we were too hasty to label capitalism as as like in crisis? Do you think capitalism's because obviously after the Second World War things actually stabilized capitalism quite a bit. Whereas nowadays, I don't know, personally I think we're heading in a crisis of capitalism direction. I think most people would agree. But do we think that would we divide capitalism into different periods, I suppose would be a question of like this I think I'm thinking about I find quite interesting is the concept of postmodernism and how this plays into whether this is something that is less like a new epoch of the capitalist era, a postmodern, a post-war era where the revolution failed. What do we do now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess there's two parts to the question. The first of all, like, has capitalism changed? And in some sense, it has. Like, capitalism has developed and changed from the 1840s. And this is also relating back to what the Adorno piece I was talking about. The full name of the text is industri- uh, industrial capitalism versus post-industrial society or something. Is Marx obsolete? And where he poses that some of the crises that Marx was talking about, some contradictions have, in some sense, been fixed or resolved in some sense. He's posing the question of is it possible that we don't need Marxism anymore? And this question, but he also counterposes that with new forms of domination. We can find in his other works the authoritarian state and new forms of social and economic domination that are arising during his time. And that's the sort of the post-war prosperity was a sort of a brief moment, and now we find ourselves back into sort of economic, not really regress, but we're finding it always comes back to crisis. As to the second point about postmodernism, well, yeah, postmodernism is precisely denying. It rose out of, I guess you could say, a rejection of Marxism because Marxism failed, because socialism also failed, and also kind of denies the sort of modernity of mankind that um, being the distinction between ancient and modern society, and as modern humans, what do we actually mean by achieving freedom? So it kind of denies that distinction. Of course, I'm not saying that postmodernism is all bullshit, but there's some very interesting things that postmodernists have to say. But that denial of the distinction between ancient and modern man kind of denies the Marxist, how Marx understands modernity, as Menon was articulating as giving meaning to modernity as the second enlightenment. Any other questions? Yep.
I think there's the your presentation of Marx is interesting. I like it, but I think there are some real problems.
All good.
For instance, the idea of, say, progressive history, and this idea that sort of like capitalism itself is a progressive mode of production and so on and so forth. And by extension, capitalism is the sort of the final sort of like instance of progress vis-a-vis feudal society, mentioned society, and so on and so forth, right? To an extent which Marx initially takes over from Hegel, that he himself starts to call it into question later in his work. Like towards the end of his life, he reassessed this idea of progressiveness. Most interestingly, he did it when he was communicating with Russian revolutionaries in the 1870s. So there is a letter to Vera Zasulich where he essentially says to her, "My schema is appropriate perhaps for Western Europe and nowhere else." And he's very clear about that. Something that is a massive change for Marx, because there is a progressive historical schema in the Communist Manifesto and his early work. The reason why I bring this up is that you mentioned something about sort of like capitalism being in crisis and capitalism not being in crisis, yeah? And like one thing to say, for instance, some, let's say heterodox Marxists have sort of drawn out of Marx over the last 40 or 50 years. And it's in Marx. It's definitely in the third volume of Capital, but it's in all of Capital and Theories of Surplus Value. Is that capital is a relation of crisis. There's the normal operation of capital is the capital is based upon a sundering of production and consumption, a sundering of the producers from control of the means of production. It tends towards crisis. This is one of the arguments Marx really tries to grapple with in Capital, and that it always reasserts itself. Yeah? So that even if you look at sort of periods of capital that apparently are, capital operating normally, well, you can borrow into. Okay, like when we talk about the post-war, the 30 glorious years after 1945, we can mostly talk about Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand. These the so-called advanced capitalist economies to a point. I'm not sure if you spoke to someone in China or in Southeast Asia at the very same time, they would agree with you that this was the best of all possible times, economically speaking. And for instance, the 30 glorious years were very much dependent upon the ruination and destruction that had been down on Europe and elsewhere in the 1940s. So look, I really sort of like try and I want to reject this idea of let's say a sort of an inverted sort of materialized Hegelian spirit sort of operating through history. And look, I'll just leave with this comment, right? This idea that sort of freedom has progressed through history, okay? Which I'm a little bit unclear where you stand on this, Ali. I would dare say that if you spoke to Indigenous Australians prior to 1788, that perhaps they would not even sort of understand the sort of European sort of concepts of freedom and slavery to an extent. But let's say we roll back the historical market to 10,000 years ago, or even 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. And I think the idea of sort of freedom or lack thereof starts to make no sense at all. Arguably, we have societies that are not hierarchical, are not class-based. They do not have a sort of separate ruling class. So the question of sort of freedom and slavery really just does not arise in these societies. So when we're talking about the progress of freedom, really, we're talking about the progress of slavery and hierarchy and oppression in class society. Anyway, I'll
No, it's all good. I'll, I'll start with the bit about capitalism as progressive. I think it may have come out that way, but really it's not the fact that capitalism is progressive. In fact, it is a crisis. It represents a regression from bourgeois society. That with these new modes of production, it's it's presenting the possibility for working less, becoming richer contradictorily. So in some sense, it's not progressive. The way I understand how Marx understands capitalism is that posing a posing a problem and a crisis for, as I said, bourgeois ideology, the bourgeois individual himself, he trades his labor and he is able to provide for himself. This notion has come into crisis in capitalism. Well, now capitalism providing this regression, the next stage, in some sense, the proletarization of the working class can act as a possibility for socialism and new society. So, in some sense, capitalism could be said to progressive insofar as it is a necessary step towards socialism. It's not the fact that capitalism itself is this progressively economic or industrial force, but it's the fact that it has regressed and put into contradiction bourgeois forms of production and bourgeois social relations, and that in order to overcome these old, not really, I don't want to say old, but these inadequate bourgeois social relations into a possible socialist world, and that this socialist world is really possible through um, the full realization of capitalism. As for the second bit about freedom, in the little page actually there is a distinction even between, perhaps it didn't come through the presentation, but Chris himself makes a distinction between, as you call it, primitive communist society, where, as you're right, there wasn't a class distinction. I think in the Communist Manifesto, the very first line, all history is a history of class struggle. Engels added a note that all written history, and here is, I guess, a kind of a clever note to say that what he means by all written history being class struggle, he does mean the history of starting from sort of agricultural, where these hierarchies were starting to manifest themselves, and where we're starting to see more strict forms of social hierarchy, where we're starting to see more sort of strict forms of being born into this certain life. So in some sense, I agree that in this sort of primitive communist form, the concept of freedom, as we understand it as people, not just in the 21st century, but I guess as modernity and people and students of the Enlightenment understand it, doesn't really apply to this sort of primitive communist understanding of freedom. What I think is important, perhaps, is to say that we have progress, that primitive communism was also dissolving in its adequacy towards maintaining a stable society where we get these more ancient agricultural hierarchical systems. And this, in time, also became inadequate towards meeting new ends and meeting new productive forces. And it's not to kind of put on a historicist lens and say everything is kind of a progressive history. It's like a linear progression or even an exponential one. It's kind of like, as Hegel articulates it, it repeats itself, that we have these instances of emergences of freedom, but also a crisis of freedom, and that this sort of repetition is precisely how we can dialectically understand it. A final point about sort of the spirits and like how Hegel understands um, the spirit and the spirit of absolute spirits within the historical movement towards freedom. Marx himself, influenced by Feuerbach and Engels himself, do kind of say that we would need to abolish and put away this aspects of the mystical German idealism, and instead favor a dialectical materialist sort of perspective. I hope that's clear. Connor?
I just think the point Anthony raised, it's an important point. Sort of, as long as since Marx and Engels died, there's been this sort of debate about the materialist conception of history and sort of the more teleological historicist A to B to C interpretation, and then the more the one that Anthony raised, where it's a little bit more it's not linear. It's not set. It's not this one way that all societies develop. It's more of a just a dialectical relationship without a clear sort of direction. And I think I'm not really sure where I stand on which interpretation of. Obviously, I think the pure historicist interpretation was obviously quite flawed, but I think where I stand on that topic is I'm not sure yet, but I think it's a very important topic. I think the materialist conception of history is probably the most important public piece of Marx.
Did you want to ask any questions or any raise? No, it's fine. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah. Look, personally, I think that Marx is describing sort of like this idea of sort of like in the preface to the contribution to a political economy, where he talks about sort of the forces and relations to production coming into contradiction. I think he's talking specifically about capitalist society. I like a lot of Marxists and a lot of Engels being spilled over whether or not you have sort of like a similar sort of like contradiction in feudal society and slave-based society, and I think frankly, it's a ridiculous sort of like proposition, because you just simply don't have a development of forces of production in the same way you do in capitalist society. And that technical development that you witness in capitalist society, it's not to say there isn't technical development in pre-capitalist societies, but there's no driver in pre-capitalist societies in the sense that the market itself drives technical innovation. Yeah. And often technical innovation is driven on the basis of trying to actually either replace labor or, as Marx says in Capital Volume 1, undermine the refractory stand of the labourers, right? Like literally sort of like, used in order to stop workers going on strike and opposing sort of new deals being sort of coming by capital. Yeah. So like, that's why I would say that, for instance, this idea of a grand sort of Marxist sort of like concept of history that you can talk about its progressive development, slavery, feudalism, capitalism is I think highly problematic. I think the materialist conception of history is a powerful heuristic for understanding capitalist societies and fully capitalist societies, but outside of that, I think it has very limited sort of usefulness. Yeah.
Yeah, Francis?
Can I just respond? So actually, I think we do see a drive for technological innovation, but it's like warfare. Um, like if you look at something like the Roman Empire, part of why they would like be a like world-defining empire is that they just were able to win wars through various innovations that like other countries, well, and like like other armies just weren't able to put together. And you do see like examples of pretty significant innovation, but it's all like directed towards the end. So like, well, not all, but like quite a bit of it is directed towards the end of conquest. And I think one thing that goes on there is that you just hit diminishing returns a lot quicker. Because if you're like the end of conquest, like the basic like social reproduction process going on is basically like you're just taking people and having them do like agriculture. And of course, if you're not like innovating in terms of agricultural practices all that much, it's just harder to like feed people and do all the things you need to do to keep that going. Because there's just a lot that goes on, and so you just hit diminishing returns a lot quicker. But there is a sort of feedback loop there, and I don't know. I think like warfare in the state is something that I think it's actually amusingly it's like something that Marxists like didn't really get to, despite it also being like kind of the reason why they were they rose to prominence in the 20th century, because like they were the ones who were standing at the end of various revolutions, and also they were the ones who were like fighting various well, it's just me, but I do think like the warfare as a driver, I think is the important part of this, and also is like an important part of technical innovation, even under capitalism. So yeah.
Mm. I think one point that can maybe help us kind of think about more so what it was kind of posed, I guess, throughout the teaching as well. What is in some sense the Marxist understanding of history? Is it, as many people have accused him of, and even accused Hegel of, a historicist understanding where we do have this development from, you may call it, Neolithic ages, and it just goes again in this historically progressive form? Or I think how we may understand Marxism, and Marx's understanding of history is that understanding how history can inform us on both um, the sort of modes of production that are creating the possibilities for greater freedom. And again, this comes back to Hegel's notion of history as being a history of freedom, not in the sense of a linear progression towards freedom, but that to reflect on history, to think about these forms of societies and technical advancements, whether they be war, as Francis said, or just general technological or market innovations. It's kind of looking back at these developments and theorizing how society can look like. This is in some sense what Rousseau was kind of thinking about when he was thinking about the natural man, or what Smith was thinking about when he was reflecting on Roman society, the Roman Empire, and kind of thinking about commercial society. Same with Kant and Hegel themselves, and Kant almost tasked Hegel with coming up with a um, a history of not history of a philosophy of history, of how we understand history and how we can understand this certain progression or certain um, analysis of the states, the productive forces, helps us understand how we can achieve greater freedom. So I think that in some sense is the main sort of Marxist interpretation of history. Any other questions? We can keep going. If you have to, all good. Thanks for coming. All good. Yeah, we have like we can end it early or 20 more minutes if any other points want to be raised, or I can just end the recording and we can just go grab a coffee or something.
Yeah, I think switching to a more informal style would be cool.
Yeah, easy. Okay, then we'll end it here. Thanks for coming, guys. Next topic break next week, and yeah.